And one of the things that I learned while I was doing this, I didn't learn the vocabulary. I'm always learning new vocabulary, but it wasn't the vocabulary of business that I learned while I was in the process of putting the book together. What I ended up learning was about how people learn language. And that was unexpected to me. What I discovered by accident, maybe, maybe not, but for people who come from other countries and were not brought up in the US, there is an organization called Teachers of English for Speakers of Other Languages, TESOL, TESOL. And it's a professional association. And I was just getting ready to do the research into the market for English as a second language when I found and discovered that TESOL's conference, annual conference, just so happened to be in Philadelphia 3 weeks from the day that I decided it was time to start learning about this market. And I thought, well, I can't not go. And so I ended up going to the conference. And in my brain, I was expecting to find people who wanted to teach English in other countries. And what I discovered was 7,000 PhDs, master's degrees, and professionals from universities all over the world talking about the science of linguistics and how people learn language. And that was the eye-opener for me, because I discovered that by accident I had fallen right into helping people learn language in the way people learn, that it takes 7 to 20 repetitions to learn a new word. 7 to 20, yeah. And the difference between 7 versus 20 has as much to do with context as anything else. And that what you learn when you're learning a new language is it's always about the context. So when you think about babies learning language, they're just hearing it in the air and they're figuring it out. And that business English is more about context than any other language grouping. And I bring this up here because I have all these assets identified. If you don't know what an asset is, then making a distinction between an intangible asset versus an investable asset versus a liquid asset is completely not something that can be understood. You can't. If you already know what assets are, and you already know the difference between a current asset or a fixed asset or a prepaid asset, then the idea of adding in an intangible asset is something that will be easier for you to grab onto. And so I use that as an example of when do you need 7 repetitions versus 20. If you don't know what an asset is, then someone's going to have to be using, and when I see repetition and using a word, I mean hear it, speak it, read it, listen.
Well, I know I remember hearing that if you use as many senses as possible, and we have 5 senses, obviously with taste it's going to be impossible, but if you can use those other 4 as much as possible, the likelihood of more learning is going to take place.
Right, and they do talk about the 4 elements of language, which is listening, and all right, on one stage, and so all of a sudden they're just speaking, and reading, and listening, writing. That was the 4th, okay. That those are, so you need to, the 7 to 20 repetitions have to be in all 4. And a friend of mine who was a linguist by education said that speaking the term or the word is more important. One speaking of the term is more important in terms of your learning that language than 10 hearing. And it's like, oh, okay, so, and then part of the 7 to 20, I realized that by accident, and this is because my mom's an English teacher, I realized that each entry that I have in here, let me go to Word today. each entry is in effect
3 repetitions.
I'm giving you the word, I'm giving you a plain definition, and then I'm using it in a sentence. So if you need to hear something 7 to 20 times, right away you've heard it 3, or you've experienced it 3 times. And then by the indexes in the back, if you start looking things up, then you get that word in a different kind of a context with other words that are of a similar subject. And so I'm working with the general idea of accelerating learning.